This is the second lecture for Monday, April 6th. We're talking about different ecosystems in the ocean. We're talking about this one gigantic ecosystem, which is the oceanic ecosystems, or the open ocean. And we've differentiated between these different zones, the epipelagic, the mesopelagic, and the bathypelagic. We saw there's different characteristics, so there's different species there. So some of these adaptations, as I mentioned the other day, are going to apply more to bathypelagic and mesopelagic. Some of them are going to apply more to epipelagic. Some of them are going to apply to all of them. So first of all, let's look at bioluminescence. It's a really, really common adaptation, not just in the water and not just where it's dark, but on land. There's a lot of different things that are bioluminescent. There's all kinds of different taxa that are bioluminescent, from protists to a whole bunch of different animals. Very, very common. So let's look at these four different aspects of bioluminescence. First of all, it's a chemical reaction that produces light, and it requires oxygen and it requires ATP. So it's similar to cellular respiration in the sense that ATP is being used and oxygen is being used. That happens in a lot of metabolic reactions. So you've got this biological pigment, this pigmented protein called luciferin. And when this pigment is acted upon by this enzyme, luciferase, it's an enzyme, then there's a reaction that takes place, as I said, that uses oxygen, and it uses ATP, and that energy and ATP in the presence of oxygen catalyzed by that luciferase on this substrate, this biological pigment luciferin, produces light. It uses energy, it converts chemical energy to light energy. So we don't need to go into all the details about the actual reaction, but there's a number of different ways that reaction takes place. There's a lot of animals that have similar reaction to some that produce different wavelengths of light. But look how common bioluminescence is. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of, you think of fireflies and glowworms and all these different terrestrial organisms that bioluminesce. And there's a lot of the organisms that we looked at, the comb jellies and dinoflagellates are very commonly bioluminesce. Squid bioluminesce, a lot of fish bioluminesce, polychaete worms bioluminesce, tunicates. So 16 different phyla. We didn't even look at that many in this class. We looked at 10 phyla, maybe. 700 genera contain species that are bioluminescent. It evolved a number of times in the groups that aren't even closely related to one another. A lot of this, a huge number of bioluminescent organisms are in the ocean. I mentioned some of those on land. There are some common ones. Fireflies, if you've ever seen fireflies, very, very interesting to see. And up in the surface, the epipelagic, look at all these different bioluminescent animals, plankton, phytoplankton, dinoflagellates, bioluminescent. Sometimes they're in the sand. You're walking along the sand and bioluminescent dinoflagellates light up. And when you're scuffing your feet on the beach at night, it creates bioluminescent. And then there's these other animals, as I mentioned before. Now, when the mesopelagic, where you've got these animals that are vertically migrating up and down, what makes up the deep scattering layer, this huge biomass that moves 2 or 3 or 400 meters in a day. That's it. It's not very far. It's like doing a lap around the track. But it's a huge amount of invertebrates, zooplankton, fish, squid, all these little organisms, crustaceans. They make this short move from deep water, where they are in the daytime, where it's safe, to shallow water at night, where it's dark, and their vulnerability to predation is lower. They're moving up into water where there's a lot of predators at night. But it's dark, and so they're safer. That's the time to go. So a lot of these species, look at the 80% of mesopelagic organisms, invertebrates and vertebrates both, are bioluminescent. And then I mentioned these lanternfish. Huge numbers, gigantic numbers of lanternfish, these fish that have photophores, like little flashlights in their body that light up, and they're used for, well, we'll talk about what they're used for. And then you've got some sharks. You have lantern sharks, like lanternfish, that are bioluminescent. You've got cookie cutter sharks. A lot of the lantern sharks, most of them, in fact, don't vertically migrate. Cookie cutter sharks, on the other hand, are thought to vertically migrate. So let's look at this patterns of bioluminescence. Like I said, there's a number of different types of reaction, a number of different types of wavelengths of light that are produced. But for the most part, you can have extracellular bioluminescent, where you've got the cells, basically, that have bacteria in them. These bacteria are what is bioluminescent. These bacteria have the photopigments. And so this can be done on a cellular level, or it can be done on an organ level, basically. Inside a cell or inside an organ. And the most common thing is for these these bioluminescent organisms to have photophores. Photophores are organs. And there's a picture of a photophore in this diagram. That is a photophore. This photophore has the bioluminescent parts. If you look at the photocytes in the middle, those are cells that are producing light. But look at all these accessories here. In the back, you have reflectors. So this light is produced, it's reflected off of the back. There's no point in the light going into the body of the organism. So it's reflected out through the lens. The light is concentrated. They've got filters that can change the wavelength of light and make it a different color, basically. Signal to those, your fellow members of your species, that can detect that wavelength of light. And there's also shutters. They open and close. So these flash, like turning a flashlight on and off. They send a signal. It's not just a wavelength of light. It's not just a pattern of light, but it could be the frequency at which the light shines, the blinking, basically. So if you look at those accessories, lenses, shutters, color filters, reflectors, all those different things, you've got these cells that produce the light, you've got all these accessories, and all those things together make up this organ that tend to be scattered around on the bodies of bioluminescent organisms. So why do they do this? There's a number of different reasons for bioluminescence. Three of the main explanations for this, adaptations for bioluminescence, is to escape predators. So you can have counter shading. A lot of those mesopelagic, this light bioluminescence is found on their ventral surface. So underneath, it's creating light. It eliminates their silhouette. So if you're looking at it underneath, you can't see them. It's a good way of developing counter shading, like having a white underside. There's also, they flash the light in the eyes of predators, temporarily blinding them, and then they can get away. There's also prey attraction. It's like moths that are attracted to light. So sometimes there's prey that are attracted to the light. Sometimes there's things that are potential predators. They think, oh, look at this light, it's flashing, and they are attracted to it, and it ends up being a big predator. Looks like a little dinoflagellate or something, some little invertebrate that's bioluminescent, but it's actually a predator. And then there's communication, depending on the wavelengths of light, depending on the orientation of the photophores on their body. Could be courtship, sending signals to your conspecifics in terms of mating. It could be some other kind of signals that are sent, or it could be the blinking of the lights. But there's a number of different ways that communication is accomplished between members of the same species. So there's a number of different functions that are thought for bioluminescence. All right, well, let's turn our attention to the type of body form in swimming. If you live out in the open ocean, you're not going to be laying on the bottom, except in the very deep. So you've got to be able to move through the water column. You've got to be able to maintain your position in the water column. So let's take a few minutes to consider what kind of adaptations you need if you're out swimming around in the open ocean. First of all, why is it advantageous to be able to swim? Why is it advantageous to have a certain body form that helps you to swim? Well, first of all, you have more access to food. You have more access to mates for reproduction. You have the ability to get away from predators, and you can aerate your gills, these ram ventilators that we looked at when we were looking at fish respiratory systems. Well, swimming, muscle contraction, is a very expensive thing to do. It's one of the most expensive. Osmoregulation requires a lot of energy, but so does locomotion, muscle contraction. If you look at muscles, there's very high density of mitochondria, very large use of ATP. So it's not cheap to swim, but if you do swim, then you have all those advantages: food, reproduction, predator avoidance. So if you can move, it's very beneficial. And in fact, most organisms, when they get to be a certain size, especially, they're very good at moving. They move long distances. You've got the smaller organisms that tend to be attached to the rocks or buried in the sediment or those kind of things. Sometimes they're pretty big. But it's very advantageous to be able to move. So let's look at some of the adaptations that are advantageous for being able to move. First of all, if you're big, that's an advantage for swimming because it costs less energy to move a certain distance per unit length in relation to how big your body is. For bigger animals can move through the water more efficiently than smaller animals. So it takes relatively more energy for a small animal to move 100 meters than it does a big animal. Another thing is the body shape. All of these surfaces of an animal that's moving through the water create drag. That drag decreases the efficiency with which you move through the water. It makes you less efficient at moving through the water. Or in other words, it takes more energy. If you're going to move 100 meters and you have a certain body shape and you minimize drag, then you can travel that 100 meters expending less energy than if you have another type of body that produces more drag. So body shape is a big thing in addition to size. And another thing that's important, especially in relation to drag and thrust that's produced, is the means of propulsion that you have. So the best means of propulsion, basically fish, they're flapping their tail back and forth. Marine mammals, they're flapping their tail up and down. Turtles, they're swimming with their flippers, their modified forelimbs. So whatever means of propulsion that you have, if you can minimize the drag that's produced, especially when the thing's flapping back and forth, moving back and forth in the water, it creates drag. It's also creating forward propulsion. So if you look at the size, body shape, and means of propulsion for all these different oceanic animals, what they tend to do, they have shapes, they have sizes, and they have means of propulsion that minimize drag and maximize efficiency of moving through the water. If you're expending less energy on locomotion, then you can channel that energy towards other things that are very important. important for survival, like reproduction and growth. So let's look at these three things, then we'll be done with this lecture for today. Size. I mentioned before the amount of energy, ultimately the amount of energy to move a big animal is going to be more, but in relation to the size of the body, if you looked at how many calories or joules it took to move per unit mass, then that declines as you get bigger. So look at this figure, shows the relative amount of energy in relation to how big you are to move a certain distance. And you can see that as you get bigger, you go from, this is the log scale, so some of these animals are little tiny things, little triangles, insects on the far left of this graph. They take more energy to move, relatively more energy in relation to their body size, to move a certain distance than the biggest things, big mammals way out there on the right of this, and reptiles and birds. They move most efficiently. So there's a lot that goes into this, but for our purposes, we can just recognize that moving through the water, you expend less energy per unit body mass if you're big. So it's advantageous to be big. And what do you know, especially in the epipelagic, you find a lot of big animals. Another thing you find is that this teardrop shape, where it's round at the front and it tapers off into the back, kind of like a torpedo or a teardrop, this fusiform shape is the most efficient. If you were an engineer and you're going to design something to move through the water that minimizes drag, then this is the body shape that you would come up with. So if you look at fish, you look at turtle, you look at dolphin, you look at tuna, you look at sharks, you look at actual dolphin, if you look at dolphin fish, mahi-mahi, if you look at even turtles and penguins, their body shape tends to have this teardrop shape. So it minimizes the drag, maximizes the efficiency with which you can move from here to there. And then in terms of propulsion, again, if you look at the tail of a lot of fish, their tail is, especially fish that can swim quickly, their tail is thin. The caudal peduncle right in front of their tail is thin. Their tail is shaped like this half moon. We looked at this a little before in terms of the tuniform swimming. But again, whether you have some kind of a tail that moves like a crustacean or a squid that are moving with a jet propulsion, or a seal or a penguin or a turtle or a whale or marine mammal, then the means of propulsion to fish is another thing that should go up on this diagram. That this forward propulsion is important for them moving around, but it's also important for them to be able to generate a lot of forward thrust in a very efficient way, minimizing drag, minimizing the amount of energy that's expended. So that is an adaptation they find in all these different types of nekton. Okay, well, that's a good place to stop now, and we can look at these other two, low biomass and feeding. Those are two other things. In this patchy environment, you've got to have some mechanism for dealing with those conditions. And you find a lot of different varieties of being able to deal with those conditions in nekton.